Marvin was frantically searching for his horse. He had combed every inch of his property, but his gut told him Misty might have wandered into the nearby woods. His land bordered a national forest, and though he'd never bothered to reinforce the small fence between them, he was regretting that now. The search was growing exponentially larger, and Misty wasn't just any animal. She was Marvin's baby, especially dear to him. To make matters worse, Misty had been in labor the last time he saw her, and now she was missing. He checked all her favorite spots but found no trace of her. Sick with worry, Marvin made his way toward the river, hoping to catch sight of her tracks. That's when he saw her. Misty was deep in the forest, but she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by a pack of wolves. Panic gripped Marvin's chest. His heart raced as he stood frozen, too far away to stop anything from happening to Misty. Desperation surged through him, and he began screaming, waving his arms wildly in hopes of scaring the wolves off. The pack turned toward him, and in that moment, Marvin felt his blood run cold. One of the wolves had a distinct scar across its nose, a scar that instantly transported Marvin back in time. It had been another day in the forest. He was riding Misty, taking a carefree day to explore the wilderness together. The freedom of racing through the trees had left Marvin exhilarated, but then Misty stopped abruptly, her ears pricked, listening intently. Marvin had tried to guide her back toward the cabin, but she refused to move. Instead, she chose her own path, and Marvin, trusting her instincts, let her lead the way deeper into the woods. Misty paused every few moments to listen before continuing on her mysterious course. Eventually, she brought him to the side of a hill, stopping in front of a rocky opening. What he found inside haunted him to this day. It was a wolf den, but something terrible had happened. The mother wolf had clearly been in a fight, her body bloodied and broken beyond help. But her cubs, still young and full of life, seemed unharmed. Misty, sensing their vulnerability, gently nuzzled the cubs as they ran around her, sniffing her legs. She showed no fear, only compassion. Marvin, unsure of what to do, knew they couldn't leave the cubs behind. He took one last glance at the mother wolf, knowing there was nothing more he could do for her. With a heavy sigh, he began gathering the cubs, determined to give them a chance at life. Since Misty had shown no hostility toward the wolf cubs, Marvin decided to take them home. He carefully placed them in his saddlebags and secured them before heading back. Once at home, Marvin fed the cubs and provided them with care, but their loyalty remained firmly with Misty. He made sure the cubs spent plenty of time outdoors. When they were still quite young, he let them play in a small fenced-in area, which he used for veterinary checks on his animals. It was spacious enough for them to explore and frolic, yet secure enough to keep them safe. One day, while the cubs were playing in the enclosure and Misty was grazing peacefully in the pasture, the cubs suddenly began to howl and make a ruckus. Their excited cries quickly drew Misty's attention, and she bolted toward the enclosure with a sense of urgency. The pasture gate swung open easily as Misty leaned against it. Without hesitation, she bolted toward the enclosure where the wolf cubs were. Marvin, emerging from feeding his goats, heard the commotion and saw Misty sprinting past. He noticed her struggling with the gate, which refused to open. In a burst of determination, Misty reared up on her hind legs and slammed against the gate, sending it flying open with a shower of wire fragments. She raced into the enclosure, and Marvin quickly followed. Inside, the wolf cubs were barking frantically at something. Pushing past Misty, Marvin glimpsed a snake, one of the most dangerous species in the region. If it bit any of the cubs, they would be in serious trouble. Normally, wolf pups would learn to avoid such threats from their mother, but without her guidance, their curiosity was putting them at risk. Both Marvin and Misty had grown deeply attached to the cubs, and losing any of them would be devastating. Misty, driven by her protective instincts, acted with lightning speed. She stomped on the snake and kicked away the remnants. While Marvin would have preferred to capture and release the snake safely, Misty's fierce determination to safeguard the cubs took precedence. Marvin exhaled with relief but was immediately struck with a new fear when he noticed one of the wolf pups looking up at him with a gash across the bridge of its nose. Had the snake managed to strike him after all? Without hesitation, Marvin grabbed the injured pup by the scruff and hurried to his first aid kit, with Misty and the other cubs trailing alongside, clearly bewildered by the commotion. The injured pup, usually the most rambunctious of the group, lay surprisingly still in Marvin's arms. The calmness of the cub frightened Marvin more than he cared to admit. Was the venom spreading through its body already? He fought to keep his panic at bay as he examined the pup under the light. To his relief, there were no two distinct fang marks, the typical sign of a snake bite. As he carefully cleaned the wound, Marvin discovered a piece of wire fence embedded in the gash. His earlier suspicions were confirmed. The snake hadn't been responsible. Instead, the injury had been caused by one of the wire fragments that had flown from the gate. The wire had struck the pup on the nose rather than in a more critical area. Marvin treated the wound diligently over the next few days. Though the injury did not become infected, the damage left a permanent scar on the pup's nose, where the fur never grew back. The wolf pups had become a beloved part of Marvin's family, with Misty serving as their equine mother. Despite Marvin's intention for them to eventually return to the wild, they resisted his attempts to coax them into the forest as they grew older. Instead, he constructed a large outdoor enclosure for them, allowing them the freedom to come and go as they pleased. Although they enjoyed their new home, they frequently sought comfort by curling up next to Misty in the stables. By the next summer, the pups were nearly fully grown and began to display signs of restlessness. They ventured out for longer periods and spent less time at Marvin's place. One day, they simply didn't return. They had ventured into the wild where they truly belonged. Misty was understandably saddened by their departure, but her sadness was soon overshadowed by the excitement of a new chapter in her life. She was expecting a foal of her own. Marvin closely monitored Misty's pregnancy, scheduling regular checkups with an equine vet every 2 weeks to ensure her well-being. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, but when labor began, Marvin grew concerned. Misty was unusually restless and appeared to be struggling, and the labor was taking longer than expected. Marvin decided to call the vet for an emergency visit. However, when he returned after making the call, he was shocked to find the gate open and Misty gone. In that moment, Marvin's worry for the vet was completely forgotten as he raced outside to find Misty. His heart pounded with fear when he discovered her surrounded by wolves. But as he took in the scene and saw the familiar scar on one of the wolves' faces, a wave of relief washed over him. These were the wolf pups he had raised alongside Misty. He trusted that they would never harm their adoptive mother. Yet, as quickly as relief came, doubt crept in. The pups had been wild for a few years. Could they have forgotten Misty? Might they be envious of her baby? Although he recognized the 3 pups he had raised, there were other entirely wild wolves among them, and he feared for the foal's safety. Misty, however, had no time to worry about anything else. The foal was coming. Marvin could see the head emerging, but when the wolves began to pull the foal from Misty with their sharp fangs, he braced himself for the worst. Misty, exhausted, lay on the ground next to the pack, too worn out to resist. Marvin's heart ached as he watched, anticipating a tragic outcome. To his astonishment, his fears were unfounded. As soon as the foal was free, the wolves gently set him down and began to lick him tenderly, as if he were their own. They cleaned him with great care and nudged him to stand up. It was remarkable to see how their bond with Misty had so seamlessly extended to her new baby. Tears welled in Marvin's eyes as he observed the scene. The wolves also attended to Misty, who seemed to have regained her calm despite her exhaustion. They nestled close to her, offering comfort with their licks. It was a beautiful and heartwarming display of the bond that had formed between them all. Marvin had to break the heartwarming scene to tend to Misty and her new foal. While the rest of the wolf pack maintained their distance, the wolves he had raised bounded over to greet him. He instinctively reached out to scratch their heads, but hesitated, unsure if they would still welcome the gesture. The wolf with the scar, however, approached and gently placed his head in Marvin's hand, clearly craving the familiar affection. It felt like a touching family reunion. Misty and her foal were doing well, but as dusk settled, Misty seemed to sense it was time to head home. She rose with a weary grace, and Marvin carefully picked up the weak little foal, whose legs were still too unsteady for the journey. He prepared himself for a farewell to the wolves, but to his surprise, they trotted alongside him as he made his way back. They even paused to watch as Marvin settled Misty and her baby into the stable for the night. Marvin was initially concerned about his other animals with the wild wolves around, but it seemed his original pack had made it clear that these new arrivals were allies, not threats. Thankfully, none of his goats or other livestock were lost to the wolves. What surprised him even more was that the wolves seemed to have decided they wanted to spend more time at his place. They gravitated towards the enclosure he had once used as their den, where their old bedding and water bowls still remained untouched. Marvin opened the door to the enclosure, and the entire pack wandered in. They settled in and stayed for a few days, observing as the foal grew stronger. When they finally left, it was with a sense of fulfillment. Marvin felt a pang of sadness at their departure, but was grateful for their timely intervention. To his delight, this wasn't the last he'd see of them. The wolves returned to their den regularly, enjoying Marvin's care and company. They seemed to thrive on the best of both worlds, and Marvin was more than happy to play his part in their continued well-being.